Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 222. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with author Jane Buckingham about her new young adult psychological thriller, A Lie for a Lie. In this novel, Sabrina Richard's carefully orchestrated future is on the line when she finds herself ensnared in a series of high school revenge pranks that get out of hand. By messaging a revenge account, she and her fellow classmates can exact revenge on their enemies. But at what cost? Sabrina discovers she's being set up to take the fall for a prank gone wrong and must uncover the mastermind behind the revenge account before it's too late. This is Jane's debut work of fiction. She wanted to write fiction for a long time and had an idea for a novel when she was younger, but that project was set aside after the death of her mother. Jane went on to write nonfiction for years, before finally deciding to return to fiction during the pandemic. A Lie for a Lie is the result of that effort. In this episode, I'll chat with Jane about her writing journey, why social media, which is central to her story, is her least favorite part of being an author, and why she wanted her novel to convey the intense pressures young people face today, as well as a few other things. Coming up. Jane Buckingham, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Thank you.
I thought what we could do today is start by talking about your new book, A Lie for a Lie. If you don't mind, tell us a little bit about this book and what inspired you to write it.
Well, several things. I have always written nonfiction, and yet when I was younger, sounds like a sad story, but it's all good. When I was 21, I actually lived in Manhattan, and I had an idea to write a book about 4 girls in Manhattan and that crazy sort of New York City lifestyle. And I was lucky enough to get a contract as a young person and started writing. But then my mom died very suddenly, and I was certainly in a place where I didn't want to write fiction. You have to be alone with your head. Suddenly these girls' lives seem trivial. And I really put fiction away for a long time. And yet it was something that always sort of hung over my head. That's something that I'd really like to try to do. And through my life, raising kids, I was writing nonfiction. I have a whole other career that is my real job. And yet through the pandemic and through life sort of slowing down, I said, you know what, maybe it's time for me to sit with my head and see if I can write a novel. And I love the young adult space. And then I also, without giving any spoiler alerts, part of the story is based on a true story. And when I heard this story, I thought, oh my goodness, someone needs to include this in a novel somewhere.
So I was going to ask you what that spark was for this particular story. What was that thing that caught your attention or made you think, wait a minute, I think maybe there's a story here? And was it hearing that real life story?
It really was. And, part of my quote, real career is I do a lot of research on young people and the generations. And I have a lot of respect for them. And I try very hard to represent them accurately in the work that I do, which is talking to companies about them. And when I heard this story, which was about 2 friends, one friend really turning on the other in a very unpleasant way because of the stress and pressure that comes along with being a teen today, I just thought, oh, I want to look at this for the good and the bad of it and understand and portray a little bit some of the pressure that young people face. But because I love thrillers and I think they're really fun to read and I thought it would be fun to write, that's what made me think, okay, I'm going to turn this into a bigger plot where someone gets physically hurt and, there's more of a mystery versus the true life, which was a little bit more of a cut and dry, not so nice thing that this young woman did to her friend.
Well, let's talk about the main character for a moment. I want to come back to that idea of marrying the young adult and the thriller genre, but let's introduce everyone to your main character, Sabrina Richards.
Yes. Well, so many people have said to me, "Oh, is that you? Or is that one of your kids?" And for me, when I'm writing, no one is any one person, but parts of lots of people. And so Sabrina is an overachiever, a girl who puts a ton of pressure on herself, who has made getting into Harvard sort of the driver in her life, feeling, and in fact, her mother dies when she's a teenager, which again, a little bit of inspiration, so to speak, but she channels a lot of her energy in trying to stay in control and be on top of things. And she sees Harvard as sort of the reward or accomplishment that both pleases her mom and defines that sort of her life has meaning. And I think that that unfortunately we have put so much pressure on young people today that a lot of people do feel young people do feel that way. And I don't think that is what they need to feel. And it's unfortunate because even in families where that isn't the stress or schools where that isn't the stress, I think that young people often feel it themselves.
Yeah.
And
Go
sorry.
ahead. Sorry. No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and I think that we see that in her and that she has sacrificed a lot, but has to rethink what the sacrifice means and was it all worth it? And, I think that is something we all reconcile with when we're thinking about the hard choices that we've made.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think you could have written this book, this story for an adult audience? Or do you think it really has to be told from, let's say, the young adult perspective?
It's such an interesting question because of course I've encouraged my friends and other older than young adult to read it, and people have said, "Wow, I really liked it," sort of
Mm-hmm.
in a surprise way. Or I've some other friends or people who I've spoken to have said, "You know what, young adult is sort of my guilty pleasure," um, because I think that there is not that it's very complicated being a young person, but I think that when you write about young adults, there are fewer things that you have to add into the mix, whether it's getting married or having children or a big career or small career, or again, some of those choices that we make that allow you to really sort of focus on the individuals themselves and their future versus their past. And so I do think it's a book that appeals to many ages, but I also think it doesn't. I have so much respect for women's fiction and for older thrillers, but for me, this was about some of the choices we make when we're young that we may not have perspective on until we're older.
Oh, to have the
Oh,
wisdom of old age, right? When we're young.
wouldn't that be great? It really would. And, or I often think, wouldn't it be? And then I think, oh, would it be? I don't know. Would I want to know it all now? Certainly great to avoid certain traps, but others you say, I don't think you could experience it the same way if you had that wisdom.
Yeah. Well, and part of life and growing up is making choices that you think are the right ones in the moment,
Right.
and then dealing with the consequences of them afterwards,
Exactly.
good and bad.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, what was it about adding the thriller element to the story that made it better? And also, I imagine, probably made it a bit more complicated, or because I imagine writing that thriller element into a young adult story adds a bit of precariousness for you as the writer, as the author?
Well, I love reading thrillers. I love doing puzzles. I love trying to figure things out. And again, in sort of my regular job, I'm trying to figure out how to help companies or organizations or even parents. And so I love solving something. And when I read a thriller, YA or adult, I love the ones where you go, not, it's frustrating when you read one and by page 40, you think, oh, I know exactly who did it. And you're right. And then it's equally frustrating when you read one and you get to the end and it was the UPS guy who drove by, and there was no way we could ever have known that that's who it was. And I find that so frustrating too. So I thought, I want to see if I can create this quote puzzle that feels really fulfilling if you figure it out. And if you don't figure it out, you go, oh, I should have seen that coming, or you don't feel ripped off. And for me, that's what made the writing really fun because fun and challenging. Fun to try to figure out the plot and story and links that would make you feel that satisfaction, but then also not making it too obvious, not making it too remote, not making it too bizarre. And of course, I think most thrillers are like, well, I think many books are life heightened, right? Whether it's a heightened romance or a heightened thriller where someone, maybe dies. And I think for me, it was that constant question of, okay, is it too obvious? Is it not obvious enough? How do I do this? And in fact, when I started writing, I got two pieces of advice from two, very well established authors. And one said, write an outline the whole thing before you begin. And the other said, pick 3 hours a day to write for those 3 hours, and then, free up your day and free up your mind. Being the new writer that I am, I was like, I think I'll skip both of those. And I started writing and I got about halfway through and went, okay, I've got some problems here. And switched who did it, switched, the antagonist. And so had to go back, had to rewrite, had to rethink, and also didn't have that sort of 3 hours in the day. So I would always be thinking and then writing at bizarre times or stealing away in the middle of the night and thinking, oh, I've got 2 hours here. And I think as I do my next one, I'm trying to be more methodical so that it doesn't sort of take over your whole being and soul, which it does.
Yeah. And that's good advice. And you're right. Excellent advice always seems to be given and rarely followed. I don't know why that is, but
Again, it's like that wisdom on the young. I had to do it myself.
I know, right? We have to make our own mistakes to figure it out.
That I couldn't do it that way.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about the setting for this book.
Mm.
So setting it in high school, which for anybody who has or is in high school, has made it that far, has made it out of high school and beyond, there's sort of this love-hate relationship with your high school years. They have such a formative impact on really your development the rest of your life. And yet the memories people have from that, the experience they had, are both good and terrible. So what was it like spending that much time in high school since you wrote this book and had to spend all your time thinking about it, like you said, in your head? That's a long time to spend in high school. Again.
It sure is. Again, absolutely. Well, it's certainly better than having to spend it in middle school. Because
True.
It's the worst. I'm grateful I had a good high school experience. Still have friends from high school, learned a lot. So there was sort of no trauma for me in thinking back to it, no sort of getting shoved in a locker. But I also think that high school today is so different from high school when I went, in the Middle Ages before electricity. So for me, it was, again, more about trying to think about how do I represent this accurately, but not presumptively, right? Because I'm not a teenager and I don't want to co-opt their language. I don't want to presume to know everything that they feel. So for me, it was trying to say, what are the universal emotions or feelings that everyone has at, those years between 14 and 18 at different times and in different ways? And then what are the things that might be new today? So social media was a big part of this book. And we didn't have to deal with that. And I think that is so hard for young people today. It's got certainly a lot of positives to it, but I think particularly for girls, it adds a layer of, I'm just going to say, awfulness that um, we didn't have to contend with. I mean, for all teens, this idea that you can't make a mistake. If you do one thing, it can get captured and sent around. The fact that you are constantly seeing things you're not included in, people seemingly having better, more fun, richer lives than you do. All of that is just something that I think is weighs heavily on the psyche. And then also this sort of anonymity of it, which is a big part of this because, there is a central part of the plot is this Instagram account, which is at Revenge. And it's an anonymous account where you can DM them and ask them to do sort of to play a prank and embarrass someone for cheating on their partner or cheating on a test or, being homophobic or whatever it is that you think you've been wronged or someone's been wronged. And they do it. So, I think that idea that there is an inability to speak, anonymity to it, but also just sort of an ability to behave in a way that we wouldn't behave, hopefully wouldn't behave if we had to do it ourselves or in person.
Yeah. I'm curious how long it took you to write the book, and if you saw changes happening to
Mm.
the young adult life, including social media, from the time you started the story to the time it's been published.
Well, gosh, I'm trying to think. I think it from, you know, really first starting it to getting it published, I would say it was maybe 2.5 years.
Mhm.
But I've been sitting with the story for 6 years, 7 years. So I think the biggest difference was well, two things. One is TikTok and the fact that TikTok has so dramatically become this place for everything. And I'm not sure if this is true, but I've been told that if you are on TikTok for 5 hours, it will shut you off for 30 seconds. So that means 5 hours of constant scrolling, right? And then they say, okay, that's too much, go outside for 30 seconds. But the idea, now granted, I can watch TV for 5 hours. I'm not saying I can't, and I'm happy to be distracted, but this sort of focused on another world and other people. Again, it sounds like TV, it just feels a little different. I think that is, and this very sort of narrow casting that TikTok does, where it only shows you what it thinks you want to see. I think that sort of affected young people. And then I also think the world has become, in that 5 or 6 years, scarier. And more between COVID and the state of the world and the attention to some of the really negative things happening across the globe, I just think it is increasingly hard to be a young person and look toward a really great future. And I really applaud them for having that. They get criticized so much for not being resilient and being on TikTok and all of those things. But boy, to grow up in the world where you are just constantly faced with bad things happening, that's if you can get out of your bed every day, that's a certain amount of resilience.
Yeah, yeah. So how much research did you end up having to do for this? Was a lot of it familiar to you before you even started, or were there things that you had to do deep dives into?
Um, I think most of it I felt relatively comfortable with because I've had two different companies. One was called Youth Intelligence and one was called Trendera. And the foundation of both of those companies is doing research. And, I started Youth Intelligence when I was in my 20s. So I was, quote, young, but it was sort of talking about the difference between Gen X and boomers and how we were different. And I've just continued that with millennials and now Gen Z and soon enough Gen Alpha. So I really spend a lot of my time trying to understand young people. And I felt pretty confident in that, although certainly leaned into my kids to say, oh, mom, you can't say that in a book, or oh, no, that's not relevant right now. But also tried to stay away from those things that would be, as young people would say, very cringe. But I would say there were elements of the plot that I wanted to research, whether it be nasty things to do or ways to do them. There was a period of time where I said to my kids, if someone close to me dies in a mysterious way and they look at my computer history, I'm in big trouble. So just know it's for research. And I had a lot of young readers read it to make sure that, for the most part, it was a representative look at what their life might be.
Speaking of your background, I'm curious how much of that, your business experience,
Mm.
impacts the way you write, either your choice of subject matter, the way you approach research for it, the way you actually put a story down on the page, the way you market it. Like how much of your own life experience colors the way you approach your writing journey?
I think it must, and it's maybe all writers are, but I'm probably my biggest critic in the sense that my job is to help companies, brands, movies, TV shows figure out how to be relevant to young people, typically, or to many people. And so often my job is to find the holes, find the problems, see what needs to be fixed. And so I was very hard on myself, whether it was in writing it or in trying to market it. And again, I think it's so different today to do things than years ago when even I was doing nonfiction. And if there's one area that I don't feel comfortable totally doing, it's social media, which is ironic because it's such a big part of marketing today. So, but also for me, writing this book was like training for a marathon. I could never run a marathon. That's just not me. I would get, to the first mile and hail a cab. But I just wanted to see if I could do it. And that was so doing it and feeling like, oh my gosh, I was able to do something that I haven't been able to do this whole life was really fulfilling. And do I want it to be widely read? Of course I do. Do I want people to love it? Of course I do. But it was less about where it was going to go as me writing a book that I felt I could be proud of.
Well, and now that you've written one,
Mm.
do you have plans to keep writing fiction?
I think I do. This
Okay.
book was designed to be a trilogy,
Mm.
and I have so much respect for authors who are able to envision a 7-book series from start to finish. I barely could get through one, and then I knew what I wanted for the second, so I was able to sort of put those elements in there for maybe next time. And I'm trying to take the advice. So I gave myself until Labor Day, which was a little while ago, to not think about it and to focus and enjoy the first one. And now I am starting on the second. And I also do have an adult thriller that's just the story that I'm interested in telling. You could only do for adults because of sort of the plot areas. So I'm going to try that as well, not simultaneously, but it's like competing children in my brain of which one I want to focus on. Or if one gets too frustrating, I just move on to the other one.
I was going to ask if you thought writing YA stories and for the young adult audience was your writer's voice, but it sounds like that's not necessarily the case, but it may be that writing thrillers is sort of your sweet spot. Do you think that's true?
I do.
Yeah.
I actually think I will always revert to YA. I think that's just, again, I love that time of life. I love that voice. I don't feel as much of a need to be important, and literary and all of those things. not to demean young people, but just I think it has a different expectation. But I think it'd be fun to see where the stories go. Someone said, well, why don't you do a romance? And having been through a really tough divorce, I thought, oh no, that's the last thing I can write about. I can believe in, serial killers a lot more than I can believe in a happy romance. So I'm probably going to stick with this genre for a little while.
All right. Well, do you have other goals for yourself now that this first fiction novel is out and you have plans for making it into a trilogy and an adult book? Do you have other goals beyond that? Are there other things now as an author, as a writer, that you want to do?
I think for me, I've had an interesting journey in my life, things I am proud of, things I am not proud of. And so for me, my hope is to put more good things in the world than bad. And that comes in a lot of forms. And if reading this book makes one teenager feel a little more understood and a little less stressed, that makes me happy. If it makes 1,000, even better. But it might be, I do a lot of volunteer work, I do a lot of soul searching. And so I'm just trying to find the ways in life to hopefully leave with something I say to my kids, which is just try to leave the world a little better than you found it. And I think we're all searching how we individually do that.
That is a good goal across, no matter what you're doing, right? That should be, if everyone had that goal, imagine what we could achieve.
It would, hopefully enough people will that we start working towards that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if people want to learn more about you and your books, things you have going on, new releases, all that kind of thing, where can they go to find you and that information?
Oh, thank you. Probably my website, which is just Jane Buckingham or janebuckingham.com, or my Instagram, which is also Jane Buckingham. Or Amazon is a great place to buy it online, or I love bookstores, Barnes and Noble online and in bookstores. And as a big fan of small bookstores too, I always think it's great to go into your local bookstore. And if you're interested in a book, ask them to order it. You don't have to buy it, but it gives them a chance to be your seller.
Very good. Well, Jane, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast. And I want to wish you luck with A Lie for a Lie. Congratulations on getting this one out. We'll look forward to the rest. Fingers crossed for the full trilogy. So congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far, and best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published, as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author, or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the Bookshop at the End of the Internet.